In our last video, we explored Abraham Lincoln's journey from a log cabin to the White House. In this video, we will continue the story by showing Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. The topic of this video is Abraham Lincoln and the Civil House. Welcome to History Unlocked, where we bring the past to life with stories that shaped our world. Before we begin this profound journey through America's most devastating conflict and the president who guided the nation through it, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our future explorations into history's most compelling moments. On a cold March morning in 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood before the unfinished Capitol building in Washington and delivered his first inaugural address to a nation already fracturing at its foundations. 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America and seizing federal forts, arsenals, and property within their borders. Lincoln's words that day were carefully chosen, seeking to reassure the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, while simultaneously making clear that he would preserve the Union at all costs. He spoke of the mystical cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone across the broad land, appealing to the better angels of American nature. But his appeals fell on deaf ears in the South, where his very election was seen as an intolerable threat to their way of life. Within weeks of taking office, Lincoln faced his first major crisis when Confederate forces in Charleston Harbor demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter, a federal installation sitting on an island in the harbor, its small garrison running desperately low on supplies. Lincoln understood that resupplying the fort might provoke war, but abandoning it would acknowledge the Confederacy's legitimacy and embolden secessionists in the border states that had not yet left the Union. He chose a middle path, notifying South Carolina's governor that he would send supply ships carrying only food and provisions, no weapons or reinforcements, forcing the Confederates to decide whether to fire on ships bringing bread to hungry soldiers. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet decided they could not allow federal forces to remain in Charleston Harbor, and in the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. For 34 hours, thousands of shells rained down on the fort while its small garrison returned fire as best they could with limited ammunition and crumbling walls. When the fort's commander finally surrendered, not a single soldier on either side had been killed in combat, but the war had begun, and there would be no turning back from the bloodshed that would follow. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to suppress the rebellion, a move that pushed 4 more southern states, including Virginia, into the Confederacy. The border states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware remained precariously in the Union, but their loyalty was uncertain, and Lincoln had to navigate their politics with extreme care to prevent further defections. Maryland was particularly crucial, as its secession would leave Washington surrounded by Confederate territory. So Lincoln authorized the suspension of habeas corpus and the arrest of secessionist politicians and agitators, controversial actions that drew fierce criticism but kept Maryland from joining the Confederacy. The war that most Americans on both sides expected to last a few months would instead drag on for 4 brutal years, claiming more American lives than all other American wars combined. Lincoln's first great challenge was finding military commanders capable of defeating the Confederate armies, a search that would consume much of his presidency and lead to frustration after frustration as generals proved timid, incompetent, or unwilling to press their advantages. The Union's first major offensive came in July 1861 when General Irvin McDowell led an army of inexperienced volunteers toward the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. The two armies met near a stream called Bull Run, and what began as a promising Union attack dissolved into chaos and panic as Confederate reinforcements turned the tide. Union soldiers broke and ran back toward Washington in a disorganized mob, some throwing away their weapons in their haste to escape, while civilians who had come from Washington to watch the battle fled alongside them. The defeat shocked the North and emboldened the South, proving that the war would not be won quickly or easily. Lincoln replaced McDowell with General George McClellan, a brilliant organizer who transformed the Army of the Potomac into a well-trained, well-equipped fighting force. But McClellan's caution and reluctance to risk his carefully built army in battle would prove maddening to Lincoln. McClellan consistently overestimated Confederate strength, believing he faced forces twice the size of his own when in reality he often outnumbered his opponents. Throughout 1862, Lincoln urged McClellan to advance on Richmond, but the general found excuse after excuse to delay, demanding more troops, better weather, more supplies, anything to postpone the decisive battle he seemed to fear. When McClellan finally moved his army by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and began a slow advance toward Richmond, he was repeatedly outmaneuvered by Confederate General Robert E. Lee, whose aggressive tactics and willingness to take risks drove McClellan back despite the Union's numerical superiority. The war's scope expanded far beyond Virginia, with battles raging in Tennessee, Mississippi, and along the coasts as Union forces implemented the Anaconda Plan, a strategy to blockade southern ports and control the Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in half and strangling its economy. In the Western Theater, General Ulysses S. Grant emerged as a commander willing to fight and win, capturing Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee and refusing Confederate requests for terms with his famous demand for unconditional and immediate surrender. Grant's victories gave Lincoln hope that he had finally found a general who understood that wars were won by destroying enemy armies, not by endless maneuvering and position-taking. But even Grant suffered a near disaster at Shiloh, where Confederate forces launched a surprise attack that nearly drove his army into the Tennessee River before reinforcements arrived and Grant counterattacked, winning a costly victory that left thousands dead on both sides. As the war dragged on through its second year with no end in sight, Lincoln began to understand that preserving the Union would require more than military victory. It would require striking at the institution that had caused the war in the first place. Slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederate economy and society, providing the labor that grew the cotton funding their war effort and the agricultural production feeding their armies. Lincoln had always hated slavery, but he had been elected on a platform of merely preventing its expansion, not abolishing it where it existed, and he worried that moving too quickly against slavery would drive the border states into the Confederacy and turn conservative Northern Democrats against the war effort. But by the summer of 1862, the military situation was desperate enough and the moral imperative clear enough that Lincoln decided to act. He drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would declare all enslaved people in states still in rebellion against the United States to be forever free, transforming the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. His cabinet advised him to wait for a Union military victory before issuing the proclamation, lest it appear to be an act of desperation. So Lincoln waited, the document locked in his desk drawer. The opportunity came in September 1862 when Lee invaded Maryland, hoping that a victory on Northern soil might bring foreign recognition of the Confederacy and turn Northern public opinion against the war. McClellan, through an extraordinary stroke of luck, obtained a copy of Lee's orders showing his army divided into scattered columns, giving the Union commander a chance to destroy the Confederate army piecemeal. But McClellan moved slowly, as always, allowing Lee to concentrate his forces near the town of Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. The resulting battle on September 17 was the bloodiest single day in American history, with more than 23,000 casualties as Union and Confederate forces attacked and counterattacked across cornfields, woods, and a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane. McClellan had the numerical advantage and fresh troops in reserve, but he refused to commit them, allowing Lee's battered army to retreat back into Virginia rather than pursuing and potentially ending the war. Despite McClellan's failure to win a decisive victory, Antietam was enough of a success to give Lincoln the political cover he needed. 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that on the first day of January 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be declared free. The proclamation did not apply to border states that remained in the Union or to areas of the Confederacy already under Union control, leading critics then and since to point out its limitations. But Lincoln was bound by the Constitution and could only act against slavery in his capacity as commander-in-chief dealing with states in rebellion. The proclamation transformed the war's meaning, ensuring that a Confederate victory would mean not just Southern independence but the perpetuation of slavery, while a Union victory would bring slavery's eventual destruction. It also opened the door for Black Americans to serve in the Union military, and nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would ultimately fight for the Union, their service and sacrifice helping to secure both Northern victory and their own freedom. Lincoln's relationship with his generals continued to be troubled as he searched desperately for commanders who would fight. He replaced McClellan with Ambrose Burnside, who promptly led the Army of the Potomac to disaster at Fredericksburg, ordering suicidal frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions that left thousands of Union soldiers dead or wounded with nothing to show for their sacrifice. Burnside gave way to Joseph Hooker, who talked boldly of his plans to destroy Lee's army but suffered a humiliating defeat at Chancellorsville when Lee divided his smaller force and attacked the Union Army from multiple directions, sending Hooker into confused retreat. Lee followed up his victory at Chancellorsville by launching a second invasion of the North, marching his army through Maryland into Pennsylvania, hoping to threaten Washington, Baltimore, or Philadelphia and force Lincoln to negotiate peace. Lincoln replaced Hooker with George Meade just days before the two armies collided accidentally near the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. For 3 days in early July 1863, the fate of the nation hung in the balance as Union and Confederate forces fought desperately for control of the ridges and hills surrounding Gettysburg. The battle reached its climax on the third day when Lee ordered nearly 15,000 Confederate soldiers to assault the center of the Union line in an attack known as Pickett's Charge, a mile-long advance across open ground against entrenched Union artillery and infantry. The Confederate assault was shattered with terrible losses, and Lee's army began its retreat back to Virginia, never again able to mount a major offensive into Northern territory. On the same day that Meade won at Gettysburg, Grant captured Vicksburg on the Mississippi River after a brilliant campaign of maneuver and siege, giving the Union control of the entire Mississippi and cutting the Confederacy in two. These twin victories marked the war's turning point, though more than a year and a half of brutal fighting still lay ahead. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the soldiers who had died there, and in just over 2 minutes delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. The Gettysburg Address redefined the war's purpose, reaching back to the Declaration of Independence and its promise that all men are created equal, and calling for a new birth of freedom that would ensure government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. Lincoln's words elevated the war beyond a mere struggle to preserve the Union, framing it as a test of whether democracy itself could survive, and whether a nation founded on the principle of human equality could endure. By early 1864, Grant's successes in the West convinced Lincoln to promote him to supreme command of all Union armies, finally giving Lincoln the general he had been searching for since the war began. Grant understood that the Union's advantages in population and industrial production meant that aggressive, continuous campaigning would eventually wear down the Confederacy's ability to resist, even at the cost of heavy Union casualties. He developed a coordinated strategy, ordering Union armies in multiple theaters to advance simultaneously, preventing the Confederates from shifting forces to meet threats and forcing them to defend everywhere at once. Grant personally accompanied the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, launching a relentless campaign against Lee's army that saw battles at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, each producing horrific casualties but each also bringing Grant closer to Richmond. Unlike previous Union commanders who had retreated after setbacks, Grant kept moving forward, telling Lincoln he would fight it out on this line if it took all summer. The spring and summer of 1864 were the war's darkest period for Lincoln and the Union cause. Grant's campaign in Virginia produced casualty lists that shocked the North, without delivering the decisive victory Lincoln needed for his re-election campaign. In the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman's advance toward Atlanta stalled in the face of determined Confederate resistance, and Lincoln faced growing calls for a negotiated peace that would leave the Confederacy independent and slavery intact. Lincoln's own party doubted he could win re-election, and the Democrats nominated McClellan on a platform calling the war a failure and demanding peace negotiations. Lincoln privately wrote that he expected to lose the election, and he made his cabinet members sign a sealed document pledging to cooperate with the incoming administration to save the Union before the inauguration, since he would have authority as president for several months after losing the election. But in September 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, and in October, Union General Philip Sheridan devastated the Shenandoah Valley, destroying the Confederacy's breadbasket and removing any hope that Lee's army could be fed for another year. These victories transformed the political situation, and in November Lincoln won re-election decisively, carrying every northern state except New Jersey, Kentucky, and Delaware. His victory ensured that the war would be fought to complete Union victory and slavery's total abolition. Sherman followed his capture of Atlanta with his famous march to the sea, cutting a 60-mile-wide path of destruction through Georgia to Savannah, proving that the Confederacy could not protect its own heartland and breaking Southern civilian morale. He then turned north into the Carolinas, moving toward a junction with Grant's forces in Virginia and tightening the noose around Lee's army. In early 1865, with Union victory now inevitable, Congress passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery throughout the United States, and Lincoln threw his full political weight behind its ratification, which would come later that year. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, one of the greatest speeches in American history. Seeking to bind up the nation's wounds and achieve a just and lasting peace with malice toward none and charity for all, he acknowledged that both North and South had prayed to the same God during the war, and both had their prayers answered differently than expected, suggesting that the war itself was divine punishment for the sin of slavery that both sections had tolerated. By early April, Grant's siege of Petersburg and Richmond had become unbearable for Lee's starving army, and Lee evacuated both cities, hoping to escape westward and link up with Confederate forces in North Carolina. But Grant's forces pursued relentlessly, blocking every escape route, and on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate officers to keep their sidearms and all soldiers to keep their horses for spring plowing, sending the defeated soldiers home to rebuild rather than to prison camps. Other Confederate armies surrendered over the following weeks, and the Civil War, which had begun 4 years earlier with artillery fire at Fort Sumter, finally ended, leaving more than 600,000 soldiers dead and the South in ruins. Lincoln had guided the nation through its greatest crisis, preserving the Union and ending slavery, transforming America from a nation half-slave and half-free into one dedicated, however imperfectly, to the proposition that all people are created equal. The rail splitter from Kentucky who had taught himself law and risen through frontier politics to the presidency had proven himself one of history's greatest leaders, combining political skill, moral clarity, and an unwavering commitment to both union and freedom. If Abraham Lincoln's leadership through America's darkest hour inspired you as much as it did us, please subscribe to History Unlocked and press the bell icon to stay updated on our future historical documentaries. And don't forget to like and subscribe while you watch the second part continuing Abraham Lincoln's story right here on History Unlocked.